opens diagonals for queen and bishop, immediately claiming central space and dictating the opening's direction. Mirroring your opponent's pawn instantly opens up the center for both queens and bishops, creating immediate tactical possibilities. Gambiting the king's pawn immediately opens lines and invites sharp, tactical battles, demanding precise calculation. Kings-Gambit-Accepted. Black embraces the challenge, opening a central file and immediately disrupting white's aggressive pawn push. Developing the bishop here aims to pressure the f7 square, a common target in King's Gambit lines, and prepares for castling. Developing the knight to e7 shores up the f5 pawn's defense and prepares for castling, but it obstructs the bishop's diagonal. Developing this knight efficiently contests the center and prepares castling while avoiding immediate pawn structure weaknesses. Strengthening the pawn chain against white's aggressive king's gambit while preparing a queenside expansion. Developing the knight solidifies the center and prepares for castling, while also adding pressure on the kingside pawns. Unleashing a bold pawn thrust, black immediately challenges white's central ambitions and seeks to disrupt the knight's development. Shifting the bishop to this diagonal opens lines of sight towards black's kingside, potentially creating attacking chances, while also offering a safe haven from the advancing d-pawn, a crucial piece of defensive geometry that prepares for pawn advances and future piece development. Seizing central space, black disrupts white's ambitious kingside pawn push, opening lines for their pieces and creating immediate pressure on the d4 square, forcing white to reconsider their aggressive intentions. White recaptures the pawn, immediately challenging black's central pawn structure and aiming to open lines for his pieces towards the kingside. This aggressive recapture forces black to react and potentially commit to a defensive setup, while white centralizes a knight. The knight's leap to d5 aggressively challenges white's central knight, aiming to disrupt its control and potentially open lines for black's pieces, hinting at a desire to recapture the pawn on e4 in the near future. Pivoting the queen to pressure the d-pawn aims to unlock piece play and create an immediate central challenge, seeking to disrupt black's developing harmony and seize the initiative. Uplifting the bishop to e7 solidifies the kingside defense and prepares for castling, a crucial step to safeguard the monarch amidst white's early aggression. Unleashing a pawn thrust to disrupt black's knight, white aims to seize central space and potentially open lines for his bishops. This aggressive pawn advance, while creating some structural weaknesses, seeks to gain tempo and force concessions. The question is whether black can effectively counter the immediate pressure or if white's initiative will prove too potent. Realigning the knight to c7 begins a subtle defensive maneuver, aiming to bolster the central pawn structure and prepare for potential queenside expansion, while also creating an escape square should the e7 square become compromised in future exchanges. Opening the central highway here aims to unleash your pieces and challenge black's pawn structure, but be mindful of the unleashed tempo for black's pieces toward your king's vicinity. Safeguarding the monarch is paramount. The king now enjoys shelter behind a robust pawn shield, preparing for a more active middle game role. Exposing the d6 pawn to a direct bishop attack, white immediately challenges black's central pawn structure and aims to pry open lines towards the king's flank. The knight's retreat to e6 cleverly aims to both reinforce the central pawn structure and prepare for potential counterplay down the f-file or even a daring g-pawn push later, while also indirectly defending against that pesky bishop on b3. Reactivating the bishop to its central outpost offers white a more dynamic presence, aiming to exploit any potential weaknesses in black's pawn structure now that the d4 square is more securely defended. Unleashing a potent check with the bishop, black immediately challenges white's centralized queen and aims to disrupt white's harmonious piece development, potentially forcing concessions or creating new tactical avenues. Relocating the king to f2 while appearing passive is a pragmatic attempt to escape the bishop's pesky check and simultaneously reinforce the pawn structure on the kingside, creating a safer haven for the monarch amidst the central skirmish. Shifting the knight to d7 solidifies the central pawn chain and prepares for potential queenside expansion or regrouping towards the kingside. Pushing this pawn forward creates a pawn chain, aiming to gain territory on the queenside and potentially disrupt black's queenside development or force concessions in that sector. Sensing an opportunity to unravel white's slightly awkwardly placed pieces, black steers the knight towards a more active square, potentially aiming to disrupt the queen's influence and open lines for attack on the kingside. Initiating a decisive exchange that opens the kingside, this capture on f6 aims to exploit the weakened pawn structure around black's monarch. The queen, now freed from the pawn chains, reclaims central influence and activates, offering support to the kingside and preparing to potentially challenge white's somewhat exposed monarch in the coming skirmishes. Repositioning the rook to the open file addresses white's lack of piece activity and aims to contest the critical central files, potentially forcing concessions from black's somewhat cramped structure. Injecting dynamism into the center with this knight's sortie, black aims to disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn chain and challenge the powerful bishop on b3. The immediate threat of the knight landing on d3 or even e2 creates a fascinating tactical skirmish, forcing white to carefully consider their defensive options. This aggressive central thrust also opens up potential lines for black's remaining pieces, hinting at a more active phase of the game. Unleashing the bishop's power, white clears the diagonal and reclaims development initiative after black's bishop sacrifice, creating an immediate imbalance and a sharp tactical scenario where kingside safety becomes paramount for both sides. Reclaiming the queen with this recapture immediately resolves the tactical tension around the bishop on f4 and repositions your queen to a more active central square, eyeing white's slightly exposed kingside. Creating a more dynamic structure by pushing the g-pawn aims to disrupt black's well-placed pieces and potentially open lines for white's own attack, though it does leave the king side somewhat exposed. Unveiling the queen to h6 immediately seeks to exploit the slightly exposed white king and the compromised pawn structure on the kingside, while simultaneously creating potential mating threats. Securing the king's escape route, this maneuver aims to sidestep any immediate threats arising from black's bishop on b4, creating a vital diagonal for the monarch's potential retreat should the central pawns advance further and the queenside become unstable. Embracing an unexpected knight sacrifice, black aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and activate the bishop. Initiating a potent knight fork, this maneuver targets black's queen and bishop, forcing a difficult decision and potentially disrupting their coordination. The immediate capture of the bishop on f1 might seem logical, clearing the way for the queen, but it sacrifices the bishop pair and ignores white's developing initiative along the central files. Black's king is still exposed, and the pawn structure is fractured after that initial king's gambit. Instead of this direct confrontation, a more subtle approach could have involved reinforcing the kingside defense or repositioning pieces to contest the open lines that white is steadily exploiting. This exchange, while materializing a pawn, misses a critical opportunity to solidify a precarious position. Recapturing the rook on f1 finally centralizes white's major pieces and offers a clear path to challenging black's kingside dominance, though it does open the e-file for potential counterplay. The bishop, having completed its journey across the board, now eyes the central pawn chain and white's vulnerable kingside, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and potentially prepare for a pawn advance on the queenside. Securing the rook's potential on the open file, this maneuver aims to reinforce the beleaguered king's defense while simultaneously preparing for potential counterplay down the h-file. Suddenly, the rook reclaims the open d-file, a vital artery for piece maneuvering, aiming to disrupt white's central control and perhaps prepare for a timely pawn push or even support a potential queenside expansion. Seizing the initiative, the knight's sacrifice on f7 rips open the king's defenses, creating a dynamic tactical battlefield where positional considerations fade before immediate threats. Black recaptures the piece, a logical response to white's gambit, but this opens the king's escape squares and presents a challenging defensive task given the compromised pawn structure and white's active pieces poised for an assault. Unleashing a powerful attack on the weakened kingside, This move aims to pry open the defense and exploit black's exposed monarch.